Welcome to the Real Estate of Things podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Elliott. A very special, very tall guest today, too. He's like 8 feet 12. Lucas Whaley, Senior Director of Technology at Lima One Capital. We both show up to the same mothership 5 days a week. Lucas, thank you for joining.
I appreciate you having me, Dalton. I'm excited to chat a little bit.
For sure. We have a very complex but very interesting topic, blockchain. All right. So the first question, explain to me in 5 words or less what blockchain is. No, it's an impossible question.
Yeah. So I'm
so how do you answer the question if somebody comes to you, you're a tech genius. How do you answer the question, what is blockchain? Explain it to me like I'm 5, because I feel like my level of knowledge around this is kind of par for the course for a 5-year-old. So have at it.
Well, I mean, I think most people's experience with blockchain when they hear it has to do with cryptocurrency. Obviously, at this point, Bitcoin is kind of a household name. You see it on every finance channel or comes up in conversation a lot. So, Bitcoin really applies to one of the concepts around blockchain. So, Bitcoin, for example, is a currency or token on a blockchain network. And I know that really doesn't answer the question yet, but really we kind of think about blockchain as a distributed database. So, as part of this distributed network, we have a recording of transactions that happen, and these transactions will accumulate in blocks, and that's reported out to every member of a network. Which, in the case of something like Bitcoin, it's the actual recording and transactions of Bitcoin being exchanged. But the blockchain technology, it's the buckets of transactions, and the important thing is these are chained together, which brings in the concept of these transactions are immutable. So if you were to change one block in the chain, it would affect all of the other blocks around it, much in the same way if you destroyed a chain in an actual physical chain, it would break the chain. So brings in a really important concept that you can kind of string together these blocks of transactions to form a chain, and that chain has approval from everyone involved in the network and can't be changed.
So can't tamper with level of transparency. All right, like at a high level, that seems to be one of the bigger benefits or more actionable benefits of blockchain, right?
Yeah, certainly. So the fact that these transactions are immutable once they're on the network, and then there is a consensus or agreement on the transactions that are part of the chain.
Got it. And talk a little bit about especially in this first episode. We're going to do 2 episodes on this because I just feel like one episode we're going to barely scratch the surface, and we'll just barely scratch the surface through 2 episodes. But going through the terminology, or like a lot of words that are used here, centralized versus decentralized,
Yeah.
like how does that play a role? What do those terms mean?
Yeah, so we certainly can go down a rabbit hole here, but I guess what's relevant, or some of the relevant concepts for a discussion about how this can be applied to real estate. Really, you kind of think about how open or closed this can be, how centralized or decentralized it is. So, on one end of the spectrum, you have something completely decentralized where basically anyone can join a network, anyone can participate in a network, and there's no central authority there. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have something much more centralized that I do want to get more into, because I believe it's more relevant for our industry. And that's where you have these networks that are pretty well defined. Like, your identity is defined, whether you're a company or an individual. There's permissions about who can be a part of this network. And it's certainly a much more comfortable state than complete openness,
Right.
but definitely relevant. And that definitely brings up a couple other concepts as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned blockchain is made of individual blocks,
Right.
right? Is there a finite number of blocks? Is there kind of an infinite number of blocks? And what implication does the answer to that question have? What pros, cons, what benefits, specifically tied to the real estate world?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends heavily on the network technology, or I guess even the token being exchanged. Really, so if you think about, the each of these blocks will house up to a certain number of transactions, in which case a new block will be created, in which the next batch of transactions will go into. Um, to actually take a step back further than that, what's actually more relevant for real estate is the idea of, this acts as a distributed ledger of transactions. The idea that no one has to centrally maintain a database of these records. And even further than that, which we'll talk about, and that's the tokenization of assets coming on to that ledger or network rather. I know, kind of jump aside from your question there, but really, if we go back to some of the problems in real estate itself, barring some kind of modular home construction or the construction element of this, there's not really a lot of logistics around. You know, the property's not going anywhere, basically.
Right.
It's kind of a distributed data problem around the property. We're trying to verify title. There's a verification. If this is bought with leverage, the everything to do with that portion of the transaction. So there's just a lot of verification and different parties involved, and all of the
Right.
costs, the economic costs of all those parties trying to align, reference, and verify each other adds up. So, something like these concepts with distributed ledgers, even extending, which I guess we'll get into outside of just a real estate transaction, but the capital market side of things really could improve the economics of a lot of these transactions.
Yeah. So let's just take a generic real estate transaction and take today's example, how a real estate transaction runs. You have so many third parties involved. There's so much verification. Like a real estate transaction is kind of nothing but verification,
Right.
right? Like underwriting for your lender, that's verifying a bunch of stuff. Title companies verifying chain of title, want to get clean title, like verify, verify, verify. Like there's so much due diligence wrapped up because
Mhm.
generally these are relatively large transactions. It's not, gum at the checkout counter. So there's a need for that, but it takes a significant amount of time. Right, these things are not instantaneous at all, uh, and the number of parties involved is many on every single transaction. So you kind of just pick out some pieces of a standard transaction that we see kind of in our day jobs at Lima One Capital, and how that compares to where blockchain is in theory going to take real estate transactions.
Yeah, I mean, it's eating an elephant. So people are taking bites from different directions on how to solve that. Um, I mean, when we think about the ideal, what that would look like, again, all of the costs associated with all that verification. Um, really, this is not somewhere where I think we're just going to be there tomorrow just because the technology exists. This is a 5 to 10 year process, I'm sure. And so I don't want to
Yeah.
sound too pessimistic, but, um, you know, a lot of people always trot out title and the complications of dealing with title, and how blockchain technology could be a solve for that. But I don't think that's the best case. And I'll actually come back to that. But really at its core, there's the problem is that there's a lot of cost and complexity dealing with a physical asset. So how can we reduce the complexity of transacting with a physical asset? And that's again the concept of tokenization. where a digital representation is created of the physical asset. So everybody runs into this in their day to day with credit card transactions, for example. I mean, when you go buy something at the store, when you go buy gum at the counter with your credit card, your credit card information in full is not being sent to the payment processor, payment gateway, on and on and on. A representation of your information in a token is actually what's being sent across that network. And so when we talk about how that can apply to real estate, it's just much easier to transact information between parties of a digital asset that represents a physical asset than trying to transact around the physical asset itself. Because again, these digital assets can be signed to ledgers. Hypothetically, they can be the verification of this is all easier. But again, there's a lot of complexity there. Back to your question, so um, I want to talk about title, I guess. So in an ideal state, you have all of these records associated with ownership. The full title search is all digital, but there's a lot of barriers to get there. And I'll probably say this a few times, but the complication with implementing a lot of this is the commercial problem, but it's also the political problem. And so I don't mean fully it's a regulatory issue, but also aligning interests across industry and across firms. So with the case of title, I mean, what really would you solve? I mean, you already have analog physical records of um, property ownership at a county level. Your first step
Mhm.
is you would have to digitize all of that. Just the reason we have title insurance is how often that can be wrong.
Right.
So the value of throwing a lot of incorrect analog records onto a digital platform is doesn't really solve anything in itself. So I think
Yeah.
we're a ways from solving that one.
Yeah, that's when you put it that way, the obstacles start to stack up and make more sense. All right, like just something as seemingly granular as digitizing a bunch of records, like that's a massive amount of records across a massive number of different offices and institutions that have different levels of sophistication and resources and actually capability to even execute on something like that. And you mentioned 5-10 years as kind of a rough timeline. Like, do you uh, just speaking more on the timeline piece,
Mhm.
like it's whenever you break down just the title part of it and all the obstacles there, uh, it seems like this is like a mini decades transition, and maybe not, just because of how quickly technology is adopted over time. Like you look at we've had the iPhone since first iPhone was 2007, and you look at that iPhone versus this iPhone. I scroll through. I was just looking at old pictures the other day, and I was like, it looked like I took this picture with a calculator compared to the quality of pictures that you have today on a device that's thinner, quicker, smaller, and that was not that long ago,
Right.
right? You're talking
Yeah.
15 years ago. So maybe I'm just being too much of an old man here. But before we even break into any more obstacles, it seems like this is a ways away. Like, what's your gut feeling on the timeline for seeing like meaningful changes where we're like, blockchain has really started to materially change real estate transactions across the board?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't have a crystal ball there for sure. There's a lot of people taking stabs at this, a lot of firms out there, and again, not to be a pessimist about any of this, but the benefit, obviously, that I'm sure investors will care about, uh, real estate investors, are the increases or possibility of increasing liquidity. I don't want to understate that part. I will get to the second part of your question there. Just given that we can break property down into um, really what REITs try to solve in fractionalized ownership
Hmm.
that does increase liquidity heavily, and that seems to be possibly a little bit closer than one might think. So, I'd say title is probably the extreme case. But I guess to go back and answer your question, there's definitely an order of operations here.
Yeah.
The first part of this is okay. We actually have to have digital assets that represent all of this, all of these physical assets before we can start transacting them. And then in your iPhone case, you really bring up a really important point, and that's interoperability. So if every iPhone that came out didn't work with prior versions, and I know that's not a perfect analogy because of the generations of cellular technology and everything, but we really have to get to a place where traditional assets can be organized and transacted alongside tokenized digital assets, which I think the approach is probably more attacking from the other end of the capital markets side, which I know we're getting into in the second part of this. But really, there you really start to see some of the efficiencies in the market, and at that point, I think you can get to where you're actually processing transactions in this way. So it may not come from the consumer side; it might come from the capital market side.
Got it. Do you think, all theoretical, but it seems like there could be a case where you have kind of like state by state adoption. So, like, one state has moved more quickly, states that are already further ahead and don't have, massive tranches of file cabinets everywhere just sitting around, and that's how they go off of it. That is like, hey, we see the benefit
Yeah,
in cost, security, efficiency, go down the list, uh, and we're gonna create our state real estate transactions to, you know contemplate blockchain through and through. Does it seem like that's like a one of the higher likelihoods, as opposed to just like a broad across the country, and not, just being focused on U.S. real estate,
yeah.
as opposed to that kind of slow trickle up?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We're already seeing movements in some states, like even I think Wyoming has legislation around transacting digital assets, and it differs a lot by state. But really at a national level, I think this is starting to be taken very seriously, given that Congress just had a hearing for the first time on really digital currencies,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually the snippets are worth watching for anyone curious on YouTube. There's definitely some insight on how this is being thought about. But and I know we're just talking about U.S. real estate, but there's a lot of other countries trying this as well, because it really does help having a centralized body guide this. And I think when you start talking about what this could do for markets and how efficient it can make things, um, we wouldn't want the U.S. to be left behind in any way by ignoring the emergence of this.
For sure. One other piece that comes to mind, like smart contracts. Right.
Yeah,
I think you and I chatted about a scenario where uh, blockchain smart contracts can really disrupt purchase and rental agreements. Right. Like, the
yeah,
smart piece comes in where contracts could immediately dissolve if conditions aren't met. Right now, it's a manual horse trading back and forth, and we see that all the time. Right. There's great inefficiency there. How what Explain smart contracts to me, and really the implications in the purchase and rental agreement side of the fence.
yeah. So I think rental agreements are really, really good example to back up. Smart contract. All a contract really is just the rules that are set forth with how someone can transact with a blockchain
Mm-hmm.
network or distributed ledger technology, I guess. Um, because at its base, let's think about what makes a contract legally binding, and that's just hey, you need two parties. There's some financial consideration or agreement there, and this contract has terms. If you meet
Yep.
those criteria, it's a contract, and you can actually build that as an application to a blockchain network. So I guess with rental agreements, the terms set forth there would you know, apply easily. You get into a lot more complication with actual purchase because um, it's not necessary that how the an asset would be tokenized would be the same thing as transacting the asset's value. And I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, and it kind of gets down a rabbit hole. But how we how unique an asset would be versus how easily it can be transacted or broken up are kind of different properties. And so there's a lot to kind of consider and work out there. But certainly, any time we think about an actual contract, a smart contract could be applied and used as a solve in that case.
So if we, while you were talking, I thought smart contract, dumb contract. Right. So
Yeah,
if we for a moment T-chart this and say, well, if smart contracts are the future, then today we have dumb contracts. And in my mind, a dumb contract is something that just requires people to uh it's just very manual,
yeah,
right? Like whereas on the smart contract piece, the ability to auto execute whenever certain conditions are met, it's like you lay out the terms, and then there is the capability in theory for whatever has been laid out to be executed upon without any individual human party doing anything, right? So is it that eventually we would get to a place where, you and I draw up a purchase sale agreement and I'm buying your house, and as soon as the 10 conditions we outlined, uh, the bank gives financing approval and the
yeah,
appraisal value comes in and title is clear, and go down the list of the however many check boxes there need to be. As soon as that last box gets checked, is it like a snap of the finger, this is done, now I own the property, money flows out of my account into your account, everybody gets paid? Is it that type of kind of instantaneous, everything gets covered? Is that kind of the
yeah. I
end the
mean,
end
in
end
the
state?
utopia ideal state, I mean, yeah, I mean, you just laid it
Yeah.
out perfectly. You get into a couple of things there where it's the same problem with title. Your contract may be on chain, but some of the information it's verifying, say about liquidity or certain things to do with loan eligibility.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if those are not also on the chain, it becomes more and
Right.
more difficult to also verify that uh, to automatically execute that smart contract. And so then, you've really, really increased the barrier here because now this entire process needs to be on chain.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean that in a perfect state, that's exactly how this would work.
Yeah, that's the issue and the obstacle though, right? Like every as many conditions are in a real estate contract, which is usually a decent number, and so many different parties. Everybody has to be, their piece of the pie has to be on the blockchain. Otherwise, there's no ability for communication, verification, and execution on
Yeah.
that. Right.
So the other important point you kind of bring up though is the number of parties, and so ultimately, what this does is anywhere there is an intermediary in a transaction, this does have the potential to disrupt intermediaries because you are making the transaction more efficient, and so that's something as an originator. As a servicer or even as an investor, we need to be conscious of as this progresses, basically.
Yeah, this could be a dangerous question. Maybe, maybe not. But so inefficiency is costly.
Yeah.
Like they're very much intertwined. And where do you see the I'm sure to some degree it's happening now, but where do you see the most inefficient and costly barriers that are going to be first affected by this in a real estate transaction? Does that question make any sense at all?
Yeah, it does. It's hard to
Okay.
give just one answer there, because there's so many pieces. But really, I would say um, the confusion around funding and settlement
Okay.
um, could be pretty quickly disrupted if you had parties like politically aligned.
Hmm.
I think we're a long way from a state where you're just going to get on Redfin and pay Bitcoin for a piece of property you find, then you're boom, you're done. Um, yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, it's going to iterate more towards the transaction and purchase, but yeah, I would say that piece for sure. As far as what I would think about as an individual investor, I mean, this is only positive in that case because again,
Yeah.
you know, liquidity is increased, and the more illiquid an asset is right now, the benefits of this are greater.
Right, and that increase in liquidity that you've referenced is because of the certainty around the security of the asset, like what you have,
Yep.
and the speed to execute and the removal of inefficiencies and intermediaries. Like those changes create uh, that liquidity gain, right? Is that right?
Yeah, that, and I mean, even if we're talking about especially larger properties or the role often filled by REITs, where you're breaking down real estate into shares of ownership, if we're talking about transacting with some kind of cryptocurrency, I guess in this case, or a tokenized asset, a piece of property can be fractionalized um, into multiple parties, and so it gets very easy to pool and buy properties that way without the base or the sophistication that an actual a more sophisticated party would need.
Got it. How much land do you own in the metaverse? Do you got a few acres?
I'm not
Do
in the I'm not in the metaverse at all, nor am I in on the NFT thing.
No, you don't have any cats or monkeys or other.
No, no, I see it on social media all the time. But I'm very skeptical there. But I could be missing something.
Yeah, my take on that, and again, I'm like a 60-year-old man. I'm not. Yeah, I'm saying this on recorded video and audio, fully knowing that 6 months from now I could be shown to be a complete idiot, more so than I already am. But it seems like everything, if everything goes the route of NFTs, then there's no difference in value based on what is currently here versus what is there. Like the fact that something is now an NFT. Like you take artwork for an example, right?
Yeah,
And it's like if there is an NFT of if art is I'm trying to think how to word this. Like you have prints that get put out that are unlimited
sure,
runs, right? And those have almost no value, right? Even like a big name like Andy Warhol, right? Like there are prints numbering in the many thousands and even unnumbered editions that like big name attached to them, but the value is materially different from like a one of one work.
right.
And so you're kind of in my mind transferring that same concept just into digital format, which the same principles apply, right? If there's something that's one of one, like a Damien Hirst NFT that there's only one, like he had a popular kind of one of the first prominent artists to have a run of NFTs, and those skyrocketed in value. And I think a lot of that is kind of pop culture popularity with him, but
Yeah,
also being kind of first to the plate on something like that. But eventually, hype dies down around it, and it just becomes no different than going to the store and buying a print for $20 in my mind.
yeah. I mean, and again, somebody, maybe we'll take callers later, and they can tell me why I'm wrong. Maybe one of the call-ins, or somebody can send me a white paper and tell me why I'm wrong. But I don't get the application for artwork. Um, I think that's a very understandable concept, but the it's not that token is not as closely tied to that art image like on the internet as you might think. Um, and this does actually apply to real estate because I do think when we talk about NFTs or what a non fungible token is, all that means is that is a unique token for a unique asset.
Yep.
Which, if we think about real estate, that's absolutely true. The problem is there's people sorting this out, and there's a couple of ways to approach this. But for the most part, a non fungible token is not divisible. So everything I just mentioned as far as liquidity benefit is not applicable if it's an NFT. And then there's some crazy cases where they're like, "Oh, my plane tickets are going to be NFTs," and it's like, why would Delta give up their centralized travel database with all of your info on it so everyone can see it? They just wouldn't. And so again, I could be missing something, but I don't get the immediate sudden interest in some of that. But people are making a lot of money off of it, so
Yeah, I think of tulips.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So print out. Yeah. Bad news from Lucas, Senior Director of Technology at Lima One Capital. If you bought any NFT artwork, print it off, burn it. It's useless. So,
Yeah, I'm gonna screenshot it, send it my way. Yeah.
there we go. I think a good point to end. We'll go for the next episode next week. We'll probably make it a 15-hour episode so we can really just dive into the deep trenches of this and scratch the surface a little more. So, Lucas, good friend, good colleague, thank you for carving out time to chat with me. Genuinely learned me up on some of this blockchain. It's been fun.
Thanks for having me, Dalton. It's been a pleasure.
For sure. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Take care.